totally freaking me out.
Mama, look, 1.5 meters, I'm not going to go, whoa!
You just did. That must be spectacular.
Oh, lovely, yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful, it really is. Alice, no
One
further
line.
down, darling.
Why not?
I was talking to one, his friend takes a tandem, and he said he'd take me. What was not happy about it?
You're a bit of a daredevil yourself then, are you?
Oh, well, it's fairly...
Get around with your triumph over adversity, sort of your time in the Changi prisoner of war,
Yes.
and then how you went back to Japan to learn the style of pottery when it was the Japanese that imprisoned you, so you sort of got over maybe dislike of them and went back to Japan to learn.
Yes, well, now, so what's your question there?
I was just telling you.
Oh, yes.
How old were you when you were first captured by the Japanese?
21.
21, okay. And how long were you in Changi for?
Well, Changi, although there's a lot written about it, it compared to all the other areas that prisoners were sent to, it had many, many privileges because we had a library, we had people from all over the world who were experts on different subjects.
Yeah.
But when the Japanese called for workers or to go, or they demanded that people be sent out to work in different areas of Asia, the conditions were extremely bad, and it was quite different to Changi. So I was there a year.
Only a year?
In Changi, and then we were sent up to the Thai-Burma Railway.
So you did work on the Thai-Burma Railway?
And probably the conditions were extremely bad. The weather was bad when we started because there were monsoons, and we had to walk from a town not far from Bangkok, but they were really little country towns then, and for hundreds of miles we had to walk at night till we reached camps. So conditions weren't good there, and sadly disease and overwork, I think nearly 40–50% of people perished.
Toll on some people, yeah. So, how did you feel about the Japanese when you were captured? First off, when you were captured.
Well, I suppose although I lost my parents when I was young, there was a lot of love, and I always felt it difficult to look at the negative side of people, but I knew that the Japanese had been, particularly the people in the Japanese army, had been conditioned to harsh discipline.
Yeah.
So, and they also, of course, had beliefs in which they willingly sacrificed themselves for their country.
For pride.
So we were more freer in our attitudes. But even then I could see that while some people had been conditioned and were, what shall I say, on a negative side, they were fanatical. But occasionally I met other Japanese that I realised were just the same as ourselves. And of course all people, no people are really different. It's how they've been conditioned.
Yeah. Because I would imagine that some people, still to this day, have trouble looking at an Asian person.
Well, yes, you see...
Japanese or not, just Asian.
I mean, every generation, when you think of the terrible things that happened in Germany, and yet Germany was one of our most cultured countries,
yeah,
and they were swayed by propaganda. So when We've
So
got a big objective.
minority of equal people in one country.
So this has happened all over the world.
Yeah.
Sadly, because of the belief that they must never surrender, they felt everyone should be like that, and
Yeah.
there were terrible conditions in Borneo, and people were sacrificed, particularly Australians, which was very bad.
Yeah. So did you get any sort of sickness while you were
Oh, we all did. That's really why so many people perished. We all had, malaria and dysentery
So
and all those things.
did you
yes.
get that?
And of course, malnutrition, because there was very little food each day.
Yes.
And I'm sorry to say, your thoughts don't become very elevated when you're hungry. All you think about is food.
Yeah. So you got malaria or dysentery.
Mm.
So how bad was it like? So bad that you couldn't work some days?
Well, that was up in Thailand. Yes, it was being young, and I was lucky that I was able to survive, but a lot didn't.
Mm. Did you get any tropical ulcers on your legs or arms?
No,
Oh, that's good.
a lot of people did.
Mm. Did you see or were on the receiving end of any brutality, death, or starvation or suffering?
Actually, I could see that the Japanese themselves were under this strict regime,
Yeah.
and as long as you didn't break the rules, generally nobody interfered with you. But if you broke any rules and were caught, then it was quite medieval punishment. So the police, which were known as the Kapitai, were badly, they badly treated people. One book that's written called The Railway, in which the English soldier was extremely badly treated because they thought, because he was passionate about trains, and he was treated very badly. It upset the Japanese translator that worried about it all his life, and they eventually met up to were peace conditions. They weren't succumbing to all the propaganda, and they were reconciled.
That's good. So what other unpleasant things did you see or experience in Changi apart from the things I've mentioned?
Well, I think one of the sad things was that a lot of not only soldiers but civilians, particularly in Malaya, there were lots of Indian people who had come to work in the rubber plantations. So thousands of those people, which consisted really of families, were also sent up onto that railway. And as they never had the training or the doctors or the education to survive, a lot of those people died of malaria and dysentery and so on. I think that was terribly sad to see those people, because they had no help at all. We had the advantage that we had a highly trained medical corps, and it saved hundreds of people.
So did you, in your imprisonment time, did you ever just want to give up?
No, I think when you're young, you're optimistic, and unduly so, I suppose. We had a secret radio. We could see that the war was being won by the Allies,
So is that what kept you going?
and that kept us going.
Knowing that like help was coming. Yeah.
Yeah.
What did you do to pass the time in training?
Well, unfortunately, I lost my parents when I was young, and I never completed my education. So a lot of my education that we had, particularly in Shaggy, I could get all the books I wanted, helped me pass exams when I got back.
So did you pass the time by reading, or did you make any things or anything?
Well, chess sets. But then, being young, I had a wonderful mentor there. He was older than I, and he had a group which we all planned to have an ideal existence with a new policy when we got back. It was really, I suppose, a form of socialism. So, again, as I've said before, Chaggy was far more, shall I say, it was less harsh than any of the other periods. And of course I had a year in Thailand, and then I was sent back to Chaggy.
She wants the emphasis too on the healing process too, all that sort of thing. So don't keep it back. Talk about it.
She's the boss.
No, but some of those episodes. No.
I'm surprised at such a young one who's
I know,
so much,
beautiful young woman. Now
so
the
much
thing is,
awareness.
Betty,
I think that's lovely.
do tell her these things, the healing thing and all the rest of it, okay?
I'm going to get a bit of that lovely cake. Do you want some more?
I'm sorry, I shouldn't. As long as my parents don't know. Sorry about this. Peter just got his cup of tea. I apologise to the camera.
Yep.
You done?
Yep. You're good.
Oh, goodness. So, what did you actually do on the Thai-Burma Railway?
Well, before I got the malaria and dysentery, a bugle call had started dawn or before, and I can't remember, probably a little bit of ration had, and I went out onto where they were collecting rocks for ballast for the railway, and that no one really interfered with me there. You were working, there was a guard, and I don't know how long that went on for, but it wasn't that long, and when I was sick, after that I was just too ill to do anything. Others, of course, if you were, the stronger you are, the longer you had to work, and they were also heavy casualties.
I read in because I printed some articles off the internet. I printed some articles off the internet about the Thai-Burma Railway's background reading, but I read that, like, they would, even the sick, they would sort of treat them badly and sort of blame them for getting sick. Did that ever happen to you?
That never happened to me. You see, a lot of people were treated far worse than I was treated, and particularly in certain camps. Camp below us. I was at a camp called Songkurai. Below that was what they call Hellfire Pass, and the Japanese kept demanding people to get to work. So a lot of sick people were sent out,
Yeah.
and a lot of them never survived because of the fact that they were overworked and there was little food.
Just out of interest, did you know Weary Dunlop?
No, strange enough, my wife being a nurse, when he got back to Melbourne, she had to nurse with him.
Oh,
So, but
it's a small world.
the memorial at Hellfire Pass where Weary was, they put a large bowl that I made, which is called a peace bowl, which I'll show you a photo of.
Cool. So how did you feel about the Japanese when Changi was liberated?
I'm trying to think. I didn't think very much about it. I think we were just thinking about getting home.
So did you ever hate the Japanese in your time in prison or anything? Or? Did you ever hate the Japanese or anything, or
Yeah, well, I mean,
have harsh feelings?
I did see Japanese who, when I went into Singapore, and they were having to force march quickly through the, almost as a trot through the streets to do work, and people were obviously, because the Japanese treated so many of the Chinese badly, there was a lot of hostility towards them. I never felt that. I only reflected on, the stupidity of mankind in fighting each other, really.
Yeah. So did you suffer any psychological effects from being in Changi? Like maybe depression or something? And if you did, then how were you rehabilitated?
I didn't, but a lot of my friends did, and when they came back, they suffered from depression. How many, I don't know. But I was fortunate that my health was all right when I got back. So many, their health was bad, and their life was shortened, really.
So what made you actually decide to go to Japan and learn that style of pottery that you do? Once, like after you'd been imprisoned by the Japanese. That would be a very thing to do, like put your pride behind you.
Well, it was purely by accident that I became a potter, because a friend of mine, his relatives, was one of the few highly esteemed potters in Australia, and he introduced me to pottery, and I thought, this is what I want to do. And then there was an English potter who lived in Japan before the war and was great friends of the Japanese, because he saw the great culture of Japan. He was quite aware of what the military had done, but he was also aware that they had a wonderful culture. And he felt that pottery, which is one of the major arts of Japan, and which he followed, was unique there. So he stopped working as a potter for 2 years to give his experiences and techniques and introduce people to the philosophy of the beauty of Japanese pots. And that book influenced a lot of Western potters to go to Japan. So it was through the English potter Bernard Leach that, as you can see, it's quite accidental, and also looking at the eastern pots in the art gallery. So Bernard Leach came to Australia and I was his host, and he convinced me that I would learn a lot if I went to Japan. So I didn't go there till the 60s. Well, when I did, of course, the younger generation were just the same as the students I taught at the art school, and they were very kind to me.
Yeah, because I just suppose you have to remember that in wartime, if like there's a country that's opposing you, you just have to remember that like it's a small, very small group of people who are commanding the soldiers to go and do these things. Just a very small group of people, sort of the whole race. And then like the younger generation has to sort of live with the weight on their shoulders that their ancestors have done this, and so now they have to live with the thing of older Allied soldiers. Not
Well,
sometimes.
yes, now I had an exhibition in Melbourne last year, and a lovely woman, Australian, who's married to a Japanese historian called Tanaka, and he lives in Melbourne. They came up here to give me the book he'd written. He is well aware of the Japanese behaviour during the war, and of course no nation is free. I mean, the Allies, when they occupied parts of Japan, the American soldiers weren't free from abusing people, not to the same extent as the Japanese. Nevertheless, they were, I mean, one of the weaknesses of humans is that we have this negative side.
Yeah.
And if we look at it historically, no nation is free, except that in Japan you had a rigid military system, which was quite negative from a point of view of human rights.
You couldn't disobey, otherwise you'd die. But, and also I suppose you wouldn't have, after the war, you wouldn't have been feeling like being best friends with a Japanese person, just simply because of your experiences. So then how did you feel about the Japanese people when you went back to Japan to study, when you went to Japan to study pottery?
Well, because through Bernard Leach and his love of Japan and what he'd written, and the fact that the Japanese, when I met, when I went there, were hospitable and kind and had very many good virtues, and young people were no different to my students.
So all ill feelings just went out the window?
I mean, I don't know about ill feelings. I find it hard to understand that there was cruelty, particularly in Sandakan and other places where we lost a lot of people through which. But that often came from even as high as the emperor, who said no prisoners must be allowed to escape, so that it was passed down because of their fanaticism.
Yeah, and how many times have you been back to Japan after you went first to study? How many times have you been back to Japan after your first?
3 times. The first time was to visit and work with Japanese potters. The second time I took my wife back and I went with friends. The third time, well actually it's 4 times because I had an exhibition in Tokyo in '79. Which a famous Japanese potter stayed with the exhibition a whole week so he could introduce my work to his friends. I went back subsequently to open an Australian exhibition that was touring Japan. I must admit that I never thought at that time when I got out of Changi that I would be exhibiting my work with a Japanese potter who trained to be a kamikaze pilot, and that was Shiga. Shiga married an Australian girl, and he's lived in Australia and went back. He's now living in Australia. So I think if there's any lesson to be learned is that the positive and negative values of people are not really any different. It's just how we're exposed to education.
Yeah. So when you got out of Changi, did you ever think you'd be returning to Japan?
No,
No. I wouldn't think that. No.
no, that was the last thing I thought. Actually, Australians were probably slower to return to Japan than the Americans. There were very few Australians seemed to go to Japan in the 50s, but strange enough,
Occupation forces went to
well,
Japan,
the occupation force.
but no one went on a holiday there.
No. There's an American art critic, Yellen, who lives in Japan and married a Japanese girl, and recently his friend's father has written a book in, or rather, his own father has written a book in collaboration with the Japanese where his father had been in a plane bombing Japan, and the Japanese, and a plane was brought down, buried the American air crew and put up a little memorial for them, and they've become friends. So you can see that a lot of the enmity between people.
And of course, like all of these nations, like Germany and Japan and I don't know about America, but all of these countries that did terrible things in the war, like drop bombs or concentration camps or Changi and things like that, they would feel terrible for them now. Like, they feel so much remorse.
Well, yes, you see, it's hard to understand that the German nation did what they did.
Because I know for a fact that Germany is so ashamed of what they did in the war that they've completely gotten rid of national pride. They don't have uniforms, they never fly the flag, because they don't want it to remind them of the Nazi period.
Well, unfortunately, the ruling class in Japan have inhibited any publicity of the negative side of their war history. And the war historian Tanaka, who came up here, it's only now that they are printing his work in Japan. So that there has, because it's been a very strict hierarchy in Japan, they've prevented a lot of the objective history.
Yeah.
It may be changing now.
This is backtracking a little bit, but when you said that you had malaria and dysentery in Changi and on the railway, did you get over those sicknesses while you were still in prison, or when you were released?
I got over them in Changi, yes.
Was that just out of time or from medicine?
How do you mean?
Was that just from a result of just waiting for it to get over, or you had help with medicine and care?
Well, Changi had a very good medical service,
Oh, that's good.
so we had 2 complete medical hospitals straight within the army, and all the staff had been captured. A lot of them had gone out onto various work parties, but a lot of had remained in Changi, where there was a great deal of medical help, and there were medicinal supplies that they kept a lot of people alive.
So you didn't ever get cholera or anything?
Well, no, the camp I was in, cholera broke out, and that was very badly. People were dying within 24 hours.
Oh.
It was so sudden.
Mm.
So that, but there again, you see, I suppose if I'd worked longer on the railway and got sicker and sicker, my health maybe would never have come back, and perhaps I wouldn't be, I'd have a different attitude maybe.
Mm. So you didn't get beaten or anything on the railway?
No.
That's good.
Usually, well, there were camps in which the Japanese guards were fanatical, and they'd obviously been conditioned. Generally speaking,
They just kept themselves to themselves. Okay.
So everyone had different experiences. Perhaps I would have had a different attitude if I'd been beaten badly. Certainly, the few people that escaped from Borneo had about the worst time that you could describe. We had 2,500 people. A lot of them I knew, or when I say a lot, I knew some of them, and a relative. Well, they were treated most inhumanely. Terrible conditions in which they were badly treated and then virtually massacred.
Well, thank you for doing this interview with me.
The what?
Thank you for doing this with me. And this
Well, yes, you have to bear with me, my hearing's terrible.
No, I think this will be a great help for me.
But you've probably got access to lots of books and so on, have you?
Yes. And we got a video camera. And we got a